Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with Walt Bogdanich, three-time Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter, now with the New York Times, about his book, When McKinsey Comes to Town, co-authored with fellow New York Times reporter MIchael Forsythe. And you can learn more about Walt's work at NewYorkTimes.com. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, most major podcast sites, and at my site, TerrenceMcNally.net, TerrenceMcNally, all one word, TerrenceMcNally.net. I've long and often cited two events in 1970 as key factors in the rise of neoliberalism, devotion to the non-existent free market, and obscene inequality of both wealth and political power in the U.S. First, Milton Friedman's declaration that the sole purpose of business was to maximize shareholder profits, and second, soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell's memo advocating that to reverse the momentum of shared prosperity and regulated industry on the rise in the 60s and early 70s, business must redefine its relationship to politics and government. Well, my guest book prompts me to add another that I'd missed. The role of management consultants, and specifically McKinsey & Company, the most prestigious consulting company in the world, who earns billions of dollars in fees for major corporations and governments. McKinsey asserts that its role is to make the world a better place, and its reputation for excellence attracts top talent from universities around the world. And though the company self-promotes its values and its purpose, branding itself as one of the good guys, Bogdanich and his co-author, MIchael Forsythe, point out that all of that elevated vision is canceled out, perhaps, by McKinsey's primary value, serve the client, defined as maximizing client profit. And you'll notice how, just like maximize the shareholder return, serve the client ignores or devalues all other outcomes or consequences that their work promotes. Inequality, destruction of nature, the climate crisis, drug addiction, deaths of despair, just to name a few. Shielded by non-disclosure agreements, McKinsey has escaped public scrutiny despite its role in advising tobacco and vaping companies, opioid manufacturers, including Purdue, oil companies, repressive governments. McKinsey helped insurance companies boost their profits by making it more difficult for accident victims to get payments, worked its U.S. government contacts to let Wall Street firms evade scrutiny, enabled corruption in developing countries such as South Africa, and undermined healthcare programs in states across the country. McKinsey earned $50 million from Chevron in 2019, $30 million from tobacco company Altria in 2018 and 2019, $13 million from U.S. Steel between 2018 and 2020. It also made $1 billion in fees from America's federal government between 2009 and 2021. $1 billion. Powell's memo and Friedman's declaration are just words and ideas. Join us today as we pull back the curtain on one of the primary engines of implementation for the pursuit of the bottom line above all that has made this country less equal, less fair, less just, less healthy, less safe, and less democratic. Walt Bogdanich is a three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for the New York Times. He previously produced stories for 60 Minutes, ABC News, and the Wall Street Journal in New York and Washington. His books include The Great White Lie, Dishonesty, Waste, and Incompetence in the Medical Community, and his latest, When McKinsey Comes to Town, The Hidden Influence of the World's Most Powerful Consulting Firm, as I said, co-authored with MIchael Forsythe. Welcome, Walt Bogdanich, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. And let me tell listeners we're recording this conversation Tuesday, March 7th. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So tell us a bit about yourself. Briefly, how do you see your path to the work you do today? Not just this book or even this issue or subject, but what drives you? You can go way back, mentors, turning points, moments of decision, that sort of thing.
I would say anger drives me. The one common denominator of successful, serious investigative reporters is what we call a low threshold of indignation, which is a polite way of saying angry. And I have to say I've been angry for 40, 50 years because that's what I do. I do investigative reporting. And I think a lot of that goes back to my upbringing in Gary, Indiana, which is an unusual place, I guess, for New York Times, future New York Times reporters to come from. But it was, in many ways, a perfect place for me because it helped shape me. There were good things about it. It allowed my family to move into the middle class. It was a difficult life, but it was not impossible. And it gave my father a job, gave me a job, gave my brother, gave my cousins. So in that sense, Gary is U.S. Steel because it was founded by United States Steel. And that's where everybody worked. That, as much as Gary shaped me, U.S. Steel shaped Gary. And I took an interest in it because I saw how oftentimes they treated their workers. I knew about the pollution, which was everywhere. I mean, black snow would form like hours after the snow came down from the smoke. I once played in a baseball game where they had to call the game because the wind changed and it blew in smoke from the mills. You couldn't see the ball. So, and I know in Lake Michigan it was polluted. So, there's anger rooted in those experiences. And I think what drove me was the failure of the local media to explore these issues. And I wanted to do that. And, eventually I started a weekly paper in Gary, Indiana, which may be the stupidest idea of anyone. Because I didn't realize until too late that you need advertising. Yeah. I did get a bait shop to advertise it in the paper, but it was a great experience. I was with people that I like being around, people I learned from. And that really was the springboard to my career. And afterwards I went to work in the steel mill, and that in and of itself is a whole nother story.
I also saw an anecdote which I liked, which was that in 1970, when you were a sophomore in college, you wanted to attend an anti-war rally. Tell us about that.
Oh, yeah, that's how I got into journalism. It had never, ever occurred to me to become a journalist. I wanted to be a baseball player or a political scientist, whatever hell that is. and that's why I went to Madison, Wisconsin. It allowed me to pursue both of them. But, coming from a working class background, I didn't have the money to go to Cleveland from Madison, Cleveland, Ohio, where there was a big anti-war conference. So I mentioned it to my brother, who preceded me. He was 2 years older than I am. He went to Madison, and he said, why don't you ask the newspaper and tell them that you'll write them a story and they'll probably pay your way. And I was a pretty shy guy. In some cases I still am, but extraordinarily shy then. And I'm thinking, no, I'll never call them. And there happened to be these free phones, and I told myself that if one of them is empty, I'll make the call. But I was hoping that none of them were empty. Right. And so there was one. So, okay, I got a call, and they said, yeah, we'll pay it. Go. And I went, and I covered it, and I came back and wrote an atrocious story because I really didn't know what I was doing. But that's what life is. You experiment, you try, and I discovered that I really loved it, and I loved the people I worked with. And that's how I got going.
No, I love the fact that had all those phones been taken, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation.
That's true.
And just to hit some highlights, your 3 Pulitzers were for what stories were they for?
Well, the first one was at the Wall Street Journal. It was on looking at the inaccuracy of medical tests, and how people were, in some cases, dying because of it. The second one was over at the New York Times, looking at the real responsible parties in grade crossing fatalities. I grew up thinking, as did everybody, that it's always the driver's fault because you can stop but the trains can't. Oh, only later did I learn in my investigation that oftentimes it's the railroad's fault because they didn't cut the trees that would allow, or bushes that would allow people to see the train coming, or the train was going too fast, or it didn't blow its horn. Or the grade crossing was uneven and people would take too long to cross it. Anyhow, and then they lied about it. And in one case actually swapped out parts of the railroad light that was supposed to warn people, swapped it out with that was had been recalled years earlier, and they never took it out, recalled by the manufacturer, and they snuck in new parts before the lawyer for the party that was killed, to try and deceive everyone. Well, they were caught and paid for it. But so that was the second one. The third one was for tracing pharmaceutical ingredients that contained bad things, in fact poison, following that around the world and how it went through various steps and no one caught it until people started dying by the dozens and dozens in Panama. And I wanted to know where that came from because people, I saw it in the paper. There was a small Associated Press article that said people are dying in Panama from poisonous medicine, and it's believed that there was some, manufacturing error. And I'm thinking, no. That's not, you don't have like a big tub of poison right next to a big tub of good medicine and you bump into it and some of that poison goes in there. No. That's not how it works. And so I wanted to know more, and I went down there and I traced the path back to China and learned that things like this were happening all around the world.
Very good. Let me ask any response to my introduction, and let me go further on that and say, was I fair and accurate to call McKinsey an engine of implementation of the end of the New Deal order and the great American middle class and the rise of the neoliberal order and inequality and division?
I think that's a pretty good description of it. I wish I'd used it.
I'm going to read from one former McKinsey consultant who wrote anonymously, "To those convinced that a secretive cabal controls the world, the usual suspects are Illuminati, lizard people, or globalists. They are wrong, naturally. There is no secret society shaping every major decision and determining the direction of human history. There is, however, McKinsey and Company."
Yeah, I love that line.
I did. It was like you put it up next and you go, oh, wait a minute. They're right about part of it. They just got the wrong suspects. So how did this book happen? And let me frame it this way. It seems to me there have been a number of books, reports, articles, and so on over recent years that have revealed a lot about McKinsey and its work, and they've taken some of the bloom off the rose. What's new or unique about this book, and why did you feel you had to write it, you and Michael?
Well, I'm a proud reporter, so I should point out that those articles were mostly written by me and my partner, Mike Forsythe, in the New York Times, and that took the bloom off the rose. So we realized in doing that reporting that there was a lot more to do, and we set out really to make everything in this book new. We didn't want to regurgitate, as often happens with reporters, what they've already published. So we set out to make it new and original, and of course that's a challenging task when you're looking at a company as big and as powerful and as secretive as McKinsey. It instructs its employees never to discuss who their clients are or what they tell them. And so to try and scale that mountain, that's intimidating. We had to give it quite a bit of thought before we did it, but we thought, nothing ventured, nothing gained. we can do it, and we did.
Yeah, no, that is the thing that occurs to me is the secrecy, the non-disclosure agreements, the whole kind of, that whole culture makes it as hard as possible to do what you did. How much were you helped by what Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey had done in pursuing the connections with Purdue Pharma?
Well, we wrote the Purdue Pharma chapter before Maura Healey came out with her action. So, yes,
okay. I didn't know the timeline on that.
Yeah. That's the problem with the book. Sometimes
yes,
it takes the gestation period allows others to come in and grab away parts of your story. Look, I admire so much of her now governor.
Now governor, yes.
And her staff is just tremendous. They were serious investigators. They weren't out just for headlines, and they took their time. So, I can't say that everything we did was because of our brilliance, but we stand on the shoulders of others who worked and who disclosed how the business world operates, including a fella, Duff McDonald, who wrote a nice history of Duff McDonald, who wrote a nice history of McKinsey, but it was a history, and while it had some pretty interesting, shocking, bad advice that they gave, we thought there was still way more to report in terms of just their culture, their ethics, and how their promises to their clients and to their workers measure up to their deeds.
Right. Let me ask you, what has been the response? The book came out, am I correct, in October 2022?
It did.
Yeah, so we've got 5-6 months here. What's been the response?
Well, it's tremendous. I mean, it far exceeded what I thought.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and now it's like being, sold in 12 different countries. They're bought the rights and all around the world because McKinsey is a global company.
Yes.
Look, McKinsey's been very quiet, and we've done dozens and dozens of interviews about this book, but interestingly enough, until very recently, no business school ever invited us to talk. They didn't want us there because they didn't want to make McKinsey angry.
Right. You don't fund graduate schools.
No, I don't. I don't hire their people.
That's right.
Eventually, I'll criticize them, I suspect. But Frank, when I taught at Columbia and have taught at Columbia for the last 14 years, journalism. And I was surprised that they never asked me to come. And I asked people who were in the business school to press for, an invitation, and it finally came within the last week or so. And one of the responses, was that, a student wanted to know why we hate McKinsey. And of course, we don't hate McKinsey. Far from it. We didn't do it because out of hate. We did it because they lacked accountability, and they had this black box of activity that they wouldn't open up, and we thought it was our responsibility to do that and bring some accountability that government hadn't done with respect to their activities.
Right. Government, a huge client of theirs. No, I love that. We don't hate McKinsey. We love accountability.
There we go.
Yeah. In the intro, I spoke about the end of the New Deal era, the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s. But to just begin this McKinsey story, McKinsey goes back to the 20s. Can you talk just briefly about its early years and its evolution, its rise to the top?
Well, it was started by a gentleman named McKinsey, but he died young. And he died after he decided that he no longer wanted to just advise Marshall Field's, the great department store in Chicago. He was advising them. And then he said, well, I think I could do a better job if I just become their CEO. And he did.
Oh.
And what did he do? He laid off like more than 1,000 people. And he made him one of the more hated people in all of Chicago. Well, eventually there was, he was replaced by Marvin Bauer, who truly shaped McKinsey into what it is today. He was very strict in how people should dress, how they should act, and how they should serve their clients. And he was an impressive figure in many respects. A lawyer, Harvard grad, Harvard Law School, I believe, or business school. I forget which one. Harvard somewhere.
Yeah.
And they established a close relationship that continues to this day between McKinsey and Harvard.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Talk just a bit for people who don't know. It's pretty obvious that their reputation is enhanced by the success of some of their former consultants. Two that I would note are Tom Peters and Pete Buttigieg. But can you talk just a little bit about that, how their influence spreads even beyond the time people spend at the company?
Most people don't stay long at McKinsey. The work hours are brutal, and the phrase is counseled out. It's not because they did anything wrong or stole, pens or something from the office. It's just that, it's time to cycle out. It's more like graduating from college at McKinsey. And the thing is, when you have that on your resume, on your CV, you can get jobs anywhere. And McKinsey loves that, because then those seeds are planted in other corporations, and they eventually come back and want to hire their former employer. And so that's how they spread their influence, and they're everywhere.
Yeah, one of the things, when you sell a car, but what they're selling is their people. And so it seems that a great deal of their culture is, in various ways, is developing and nurturing the relationships that keep expanding the demand.
That's correct. We obtained a lot of confidential documents in our reporting. And one of them was a brochure, not brochure, it was a training manual, which is given to new employees at McKinsey. And the fellow who wrote it is now a senior partner. And he was telling these new recruits that, you got to wedge your way in the door and then act like an amoeba and eventually become like a Trojan horse and don't leave, do whatever you can do to stay there, in so many words, he said. And sort of like Hotel California, you check in, you
right.
check out, and that's what McKinsey people do. Once they get in the door, they'll find some problem beyond what they were hired to do, and they never leave. Some do, but a lot of times they stay for a very, very long time.
And then they invite their former employer in to
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because what you said is people don't stay long. Loyalty and staying somewhere has often been a value, but they, it seems, see much more important to spread our tentacles than to keep people for 35 years and give them a gold watch. I will say, by the way, one of the first times I ever heard of McKinsey was from to my mind, a very positive graduate who was a former employee, which was Bill Drayton, who founded Ashoka.
Oh, yeah.
The organization that supports social entrepreneurs and change makers. And, what you see there is he certainly puts McKinsey pretty prominently, in describing the sources of Ashoka. But he took sort of McKinsey's values out into the world the way he wanted to, rather than staying within the company or just working for the bottom line.
Well, yes, that's nice to hear. I didn't know about him.
Oh.
But their values, they're very clear about that. They put them on the walls of every one of their offices. And the first value is serve the client before others. And, when looked at that in isolation, as many people did and still do at McKinsey, well, that gives you sort of free rein to work for anybody.
That's right.
And they've shown that they are willing to work for anybody. Yep. And that shocked people. And people tell me, they often say, well, you didn't give say enough good things about McKinsey. Well, that wasn't the point of the book. They put out their own books.
They do plenty of that.
Yeah, and they put out something on the internet about every 10 minutes talking about some great idea that they've got. And I thought that it was time to show the other side because, journalists, we don't report on the planes that don't crash. We report on those that do crash. And a lot of McKinsey planes, so to speak, have crashed with some horrible results, and the kind that we've been reading about and that we tell in the book.
One thing, going back to that thing you mentioned about how people graduate, as it were, and go off into other companies with their McKinsey background being one of the things that makes them attractive, and then so they then bring in McKinsey to help wherever they've gone. I thought an interesting thing you said about their work with government, state governments, federal government, is it appears, and maybe this was specific to healthcare, which is where I remember noticing it, but they'll offer to do some pro bono work to begin with. And once they're in there doing the pro bono work, the paying consultancy shows up in the millions and sometimes even more.
Oh yes, that's a good business strategy. You get in the door. I mean, that's what every salesman wants to do, and they're in essence selling themselves. And so once in, that's they can find problems anywhere. Everybody's got problems.
That's right.
And my goodness, they find them. But government, that really upset me. As someone who is a taxpayer, as an American, as somebody who believes in democracy and fair play and everything, you want to know what your government is doing and how it's spending its money. Are they behaving ethically? The problem is when they outsource their responsibilities and their jobs that they should be doing to consultants like McKinsey, the public doesn't know because McKinsey is not bound by disclosure rules that affect to relate to the government. So when I file record requests, oftentimes they come back heavily redacted, and they won't even tell me which McKinsey consultants were working on this problem or this issue that affects millions and millions of Americans. I mean, literally billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the problem I have with working for government. Maybe in the private world, private corporate world, there is certainly some, interest in protecting trade secrets. Right. I get that, within limits. But in the government, no. There needs to be accountability, and government is not doing their job, which taxpayers pay them to do. So they're outsourcing this stuff.
Yeah, and as you point out, so we lose the transparency, we lose the accountability, the sunshine that's supposed to shine on government goes away when they sign their NDAs and so on with McKinsey. But also the costs, what you point out is that very often once they're in there, they start getting no bid contracts, no competition contracts, and this sort of thing, and the bills just mount up with one of their justifications being that your people in government can't really handle this. They're not really up to this new field or this new twist or something. Talk a bit about that.
Well, let's focus in on one state, Arkansas. It's certainly not one of the wealthier states in this country, and they went in there when Medicaid was being expanded as part of Obamacare, which incidentally McKinsey tried to kill. And, so I mean, this is a program that provides health care to people who couldn't otherwise afford it. I mean, it became a really popular and important program. But in the state of Arkansas, they obtained $100 million in contracts without ever bidding for them. And I talked to the director of Medicaid services over there, and he says, well, I wanted the best. Mm-hmm. And when he was applying for a job in government, he told me this, he was surprised to find, now get this, a McKinsey consultant sitting in on the interview as though they are part and parcel of the government, which in many respects they are.
Yeah. And the numbers, as you point out, the numbers that poor states are paying out of the taxpayers' pockets to have this corporate consulting company do the work that could, you'd think, be done by the people who already work for the state. Let me tell people this is free forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally speaking with Walt Bogdanich, a three-time Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter, now with the New York Times, about his book, When McKinsey Comes to Town, co-authored with fellow New York Times reporter MIchael Forsythe. Oh, when I say now with the New York Times, I just wanted to clarify that he didn't win all his Pulitzers with the New York Times, but he has been with the New York Times for quite a while. It's not like a recent thing there. And you can learn more about Walt's work at newyorktimes.com. Let's shift, I think, to that point that I made at the top, which is that inequality, neoliberalism, everything relies on the, quote, free market. All of that thinking, which destroyed the American middle class. And was it Peters who said, God, if I could find it, I had the quote down here. But yeah, here it is. Tom Peters, a former McKinsey consultant, said, I really think the shareholder value maximization thing has done more harm than any single thing in this country. It is the father of inequality, and inequality is the father of Trump. I've got some specific questions, but just kind of jump into how the role of McKinsey in promoting inequality. And as I pointed out in the intro, it turns out, as we know, that inequality in wealth nowadays, especially in the days after Citizens United, clearly means inequality in political power as well.
Correct. And I trace some of this back to 1950, the year of my birth. Not that has anything to do with the story I'm about to tell you. In 1950, there was a huge contract signed by, hugely important, pardon me, let me take that again. In 1950, there was a hugely important contract signed by the UAW with General Motors. It was so important they called it the Treaty of Detroit. And it basically gave workers a passport to the middle class for the first time. There were pensions offered, there were vacations. It was the kind of contract that people wanted and could live with. Sure, they may have wanted more, but both sides kind of got something from it. Then, not long after that, General Motors started wondering, their executives, well, maybe the workers are starting to catch up to us and what we're making. So they began a study. General Motors asked McKinsey to study whether workers were, catching up to executive pay. And they did, and they concluded that they were. And so that set off an arms race at the top to try and allow executives to make more and more money. When McKinsey did that study, the average typical executive made 20 times a production worker's pay. Now it's like 350 times. And along the way, McKinsey has helped make that happen, has helped inflate that balloon through various schemes of payment, not just on what the salary, but through stock options and tying pay to the performance of the stock, which led to short-term emphasis on short-term profits over long-term gains. And of course and that also led to kind of McKinsey's reputation as one of the great cost cutters, employee cutters. I mean, that's what they do now. That's what they're known for. They do other things, but that sort of set the scene, and they supported along the way the kinds of things that hurt American workers,
absolutely,
hurt the middle class through outsourcing and offshoring, and they led the charge on that. Really, they couldn't have been. They were talking about how, yeah, well, it might hurt the workers, but in the long run, it's going to really help the country. Well, that's not going to make the workers feel very good when they go home without a job.
No, and it's also it's this macro vision that if you look at the economy as a whole, that's helping America. And it turns out that if what I think what Peters was saying, and I think what both of us understand, is that the inequality isn't just a fact at that company. It leads to disgruntlement. It leads to resignation. It leads to cynicism, and it ultimately leads to the kinds of division that we face right now. I mean, I think the cultural and political implications of maximizing shareholder profit as the only thing and maximizing senior management compensation. And McKinsey was really the as you point out, but so people understand, people did not know much about executive compensation prior to their original studies. And then they became kind of the leader of the charge to look at executive compensation, maximize executive compensation, and as you point out, through buybacks and options and so on, really run the company sort of with that as a primary metric.
That's true, and we know who wins in a situation like that, but I think we also know who loses.
That's right.
And the workers lose, and the communities in which these companies operate, they lose too, and it just leads to this cycle of anger. And I mean, look, I couldn't agree more with Peters on that.
Yeah.
When I was working on this at the Times, New York Times, on McKinsey before Trump was elected. And when Trump was elected, I said, people were saying, well, we don't know where this anger came from. Let's go out to the heartland and
right.
find out who's angry and why they're angry. I'll tell you why they're angry. They're angry because of what they see. They think the system's rigged against them. They saw what happened of the collapse in 2008. They saw nobody got punished, and they were the ones who suffered. That's what they see. And that's why they're angry. And frankly, McKinsey was there kind of pushing that feeling along.
Right. And as you point out, they were big cheerleaders, and they're more than cheerleaders because they when they infiltrate a company, and I use the term, metaphorically, but they do it at the highest levels, right? It's not
right.
And the notion is, bring in McKinsey, help us make more money. And what I really found, and you tell me, it seemed in reading the book, that it is so much easier for them to counsel how to cut costs rather than how to improve profits. Am I?
Absolutely. I mean, that's just a basic fact. I don't know who would disagree with that. I mean, to increase revenue, I mean, you got to improve your products. You got to do all sorts of things. To cut on the expense side, you just lop it off. And we see what happened recently. When McKinsey comes to town, to use a phrase I've grown to like.
Yeah, sounds like a good name for a book. Go ahead.
At Disney,
yep.
When their CEO retired, they brought in a new guy who brought in McKinsey, who started slashing everything. And people got so outraged, including the former CEO, who then came back
yep.
to run the company and save it. And we look at what happened with CNN Plus. They ended up hiring all these people because McKinsey told them to do that. And then after hiring all these people and committing all this money, I think a couple weeks later, they pulled the plug on it because they realized this was a bad idea. And it all got washed down the drain. So there are a lot of examples of being seduced by McKinsey's words and their reputation. And a lot of times that seduction leads to a lot of pain that may have been unanticipated in the beginning.
Right. And how do you think, I mean, at some point as I was thinking about this and reading about this, I think that they've also helped increase the distrust of government, or reduce the belief in government. Do you think there's anything that they do that contributes to that? Because I think that goes along with the inequality and the anger and so on to create the situation we faced with now.
Well, I think that it certainly makes the people in government feel that way, even because they've lost confidence in themselves to solve problems. They've thought the only thing we can do is hire McKinsey. But I've always thought, look, there's also many different areas that are fertile ground for investigative reporters. It's all too easy to focus in just on the government. I think the real power is found in the corporate suites, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to do the McKinsey book and to focus on them, because I thought that's the real power. And people don't understand that, and there's no accountability, and people are all cynical about government. And I didn't want to actually contribute any more to that.
Yeah.
I mean, sure.
Oh, I see what you. By the way, I just now see what you're saying. You're saying as an investigative reporter, and the core around the country of investigative reporters, it is easy to jump on a government story, something that didn't work the way it was supposed to. And what you're saying is, if you're going to sit down and write a book, which is years and years of work, let's do something that shines a light where it isn't being shown.
Right, and where I think the real power is.
Yeah.
Look, there's power in government, but corporations shape government, as we know.
Yes, and you must have been as not necessarily shocked, but something like shocked and disappointed at that recent polling that showed that Americans trust business over government and over basically any other institution.
Yeah, including the media.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, to take it
down. We're down at the bottom there.
Yeah, to take out to make it personal. Yes.
In interest of full disclosure, I should point out that the McKinsey advised the New York Times.
Yes.
And they, I'm told, did some good work and helped solidify our finances. So that's to their credit. I mean, they're not evil per se. I think some of the things they do are really bad and harmful and stupid, and they shouldn't do it, and they should be ashamed of it, and hopefully some of them are. But I've met a lot of McKinsey people in working on this book, and I've come to like them. Most of them. I don't know that many of them, but they're the kind of people I'd like to have as friends.
Yeah.
So they're not all bad. And there are people, young, idealistic people that get hired by McKinsey, and those are the ones they want. And the problem is when you hire young, idealistic people and you tell them you're going to have a chance to improve vaccines in Africa and save lives here and make the world a better place. When they end up working on a tobacco account,
right?
that's not going to make them very happy. It's going to make them hangry, and then they call us, and we're not hard to find.
But that thing that you mentioned about improve vaccines or vaccine distribution in Africa, I think you mentioned that they will actually use that as a case study for for either someone who's applying or someone who's new, and you begin to think, oh, this is what I'm going to be doing.
Right. And that's their part of their genius in being able to lure these the best and brightest away from working for Wall Street.
Right, and it doesn't mean
Goldman Sachs.
It doesn't mean that McKinsey isn't working on improving vaccine distribution. They are. It's just what else they're working on that's problematic. Let's talk about some specifics. Their relationship with the FDA and pharmaceuticals, and I want you to talk about two things. One, the Alzheimer's drug, I guess you can call it. I don't even know how to pronounce it, although I've read it many times. Aducanumab. What's?
Well, yeah, that's the chemical name. Aduhelm is the commercial name.
Okay.
Which is a little easier to pronounce.
Right. Not much actually. But talk about that one, and then let's talk about Purdue and opioids.
So Biogen, the pharmaceutical company, comes up with this drug, and they say it's gonna help people with Alzheimer's and going to slow the progression of the disease, and their studies really didn't show that. And there was an advisory committee that met, and they rejected it.
Now that's an FDA advisory committee who the FDA turns to and says, "What should we do?" And it was unanimously against it, right?
There was one person that said they weren't sure.
Okay.
But something like 11 of them said absolutely not.
Yep.
And what happens? FDA goes and approves it. Well, working behind the scenes, you have McKinsey. And McKinsey is, after the advisory committee said this is not a good drug, it shouldn't be on the market, you shouldn't promote it, McKinsey starts promoting it. And it helps put together, a little video for Good Morning America, in which people can watch it and think, do I take this test and think, do I have Alzheimer's? But their managing partner was praising this drug and saying it's a great drug, and it isn't. And yet they were doing it because they're beholden to the pharmaceutical industry. And I think one of the more outrageous parts of their operation is how they work for the regulators and the companies they regulate.
Absolutely.
And that's not right. They advise every major pharmaceutical company, 24 of them, and at the same time advising the Food and Drug Administration, which is, supposed to protect the public from, problem drugs. And that's not exactly happening, as we found with Purdue Pharma.
Yeah.
Because there you have another conflict of interest. They were working for the FDA when this drug was approved without proper warnings, without a black box warning, and which is indicating the most serious kind of problematic drug, powerful drug to be careful with. And so, a lot of people didn't know how bad it was and how dangerous it was, and they became addicted. And this is, McKinsey just ceded any high ground it ever had, when in the middle of the opioid epidemic, they advised Purdue Pharma to turbocharge their sales of opioids.
And that word turbocharge is in quotes because it was a McKinsey word, right?
It's a McKinsey word.
Yep.
And equally disturbing is how they were advising Purdue Pharma how to work around some of the new restrictions that the government was finally putting on the drug delivery process.
Right, that their other client, the government, was putting on.
Right, and in other words, like, okay, they're clamping down on pharmaceutical on drugstores and handing out these drugs and on doctors. So McKinsey offers up some thoughts on how to set up their own supply chain to work around that. In other words, to work around the kind of actions that the government should have taken earlier to protect lives.
And let me just read a couple of things I have here. $83.7 million in fees McKinsey received for marketing advice from Purdue. $87 million. Now, of course, that's a drop in the bucket compared to what Purdue made, but that's a lot of money. And then, as you say, the turbocharge was their word, and they ended up having to pay more than $600 million, McKinsey did, to settle investigations by dozens of state attorneys generals into their role in promoting the opioid epidemic. That doesn't happen often, and they even issued an apology, right?
They did. It was somewhat weak, I should say. It's sort of like we, should have been more sensitive to it and all these things. But, they said there was no legal wrongdoing.
Oh,
and
right.
They always attach that statement. They attach that same statement to when they had to pay back $100 million in South Africa for their involvement in a regulatory capture story there. And they always say, well, we did nothing wrong. We should have been more careful, but we did nothing wrong. Well, that's basically buying their way out of trouble.
That's right. In other words, it's part of the legal settlement that they get to say that, right? We agreed to no wrongdoing. That's that kind of thing?
The government's anxious to get its money, and they should, and to be able to start distributing this to people who need it.
Right.
And that's the deal they make, I guess. I'm not privy to the fine details of it, but usually that's how it works.
And Enron, what was their role in Enron, or was it just their graduates, or was it both?
No, there were McKinsey consultants were crawling around that company like an anthill. They were everywhere. And of course, it was run by a former McKinsey consultant, Jeffrey Skilling.
Yep.
And one McKinsey consultant even sat in on a board meeting. they pretty much helped, put together this crazy company that no one could understand how they made money. And there was a column by I think Paul Krugman in the New York Times, who said it called it death by consultant. And that's
Yeah, I mean, this was
it was. Can I rephrase that?
Yes.
Death by guru.
Death by guru.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is that with Enron, it was almost like they got to. Usually, I mean, you come in and you consult to General Motors or AT&T or Disney. That's one thing, but with Enron, they almost got to sort of design, right,
Correct.
a McKinsey company, and it turned out it was a bunch of shell companies, and it was totally full of it, and why that didn't affect their reputation more. It surprises me because as I've read that The Economist has an article recently that says that it talks about your book and then it says that McKinsey, Bain, and BSG, Boston, what's the S, Boston.
BC,
oh, it's BCG, right? Boston Consulting Group. My mistake. Yeah. Let me make a note of that. Just a second here. Okay, 52 point. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The Economist refers to your book, and then it points out that the three big consulting firms, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, Boston Consulting Group, have benefited and are more powerful than ever, and partially because of the movement for ESG, environment, social, and governance considerations being taken into account in business decisions. Now, this has become a piñata for the right and the Republicans, ESG, but talk a little bit about because this is sort of like, okay, we've talked about some of the past. This is the present moving toward the future.
McKinsey portrays itself as a protector of the planet Earth. And then, I mean, they talk about it, they do studies, they release statements that we've got to do something, we got to, control our carbon emissions, on and on and on. And that's good. But at the same time, when you're really not looking, you find that they're working for all the major fossil fuel companies. And it's part of their business model. A conflict of interest should be written into these contracts because that's how they do everything. Conflicts of interest, and they serve the same companies working in the same space. So they'll tell the New York Times how to beat the Washington Post. They'll tell the Washington Post how to beat the New York Times.
And charge them both hefty fees.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to do business. So yeah, I mean, they were, and the idealistic people in McKinsey were very upset about this, and they raised hell. And I think have secured some promises from management there, but whether that's going to last and how serious that is, I don't know.
Let me just give a couple of numbers from your work as well about McKinsey and climate. More than 1,100 employees have signed that open letter to the firm. And here we have, among the 100 biggest corporate polluters over the past half century, McKinsey has advised at least 43 out of the top 100, including BP, Exxon, Mobil, Gazprom, and Saudi Aramco. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fees. And those in 2018, those clients, McKinsey's clients, were responsible for more than a third of global carbon emissions. In Asia, McKinsey distributed a video boasting that it helped increase production at a coal company by 26%. And Eric Edstrom, a departing McKinsey consultant, it appears that McKinsey helped our client extract more, pollute more, for presumably a long time to come. So, as you say, on the one hand, they probably are doing, or they are doing some good things. Right, helping some corporations do some good environmental or climate things, but the other hand is perfectly willing. Going back to what I said in the intro, which you guys clued me into, which is that if you say serve the client, it sounds not exactly noble, but it sounds pretty. That sounds pretty cool. Yeah, we're not here for our own big payday. We're not here, right? We're serving. But that when it comes to, if serving the client means we don't care what the client does, and we define serving the client by maximizing their profits, the wages of that, the costs of that, as we've been talking about for the hour, are enormous.
Yeah, and it's gotten McKinsey in a whole heap of trouble.
Yes, talk about where. Yes, talk about the trouble they're in, or what things look like right now. You've got about a minute and a half more.
Sure. In fairness to McKinsey, after our stories in the New York Times came out, they decided they had to do something. They were under intense pressure. And what they did is they said, okay, we're going to change how we review and vet new clients. And we're going to reject some, we might that we wouldn't have before. And so we got this new system going. And, is that system going to work? Who knows? I mean, I don't know. They're talking a good game. But I will say this, and this is really illustrative of how McKinsey works. The managing partner who pushed for those changes was voted out of office after one term, which hadn't happened in decades. And so that speaks perhaps, probably, to, to how
deep this is,
were received
yes.
in the firm. So they do recognize they have problems, and the government is beginning to recognize that as well.
Okay. So, again, the book is When McKinsey Comes to Town, and you can learn more about Walt Bogdanich's work at NewYorkTimes.com. Thank you, Walt Bogdanich.
Thank you, Terrence. Thanks for having me.
Keep up your good work. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerrenceMcNally.net, TerrenceMcNally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually 10 articles to flesh out the conversation, you can email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, TEMcNally at mac.com, M-A-C, at mac.com. Or you can sign up at my site. You can also sign up at most of those major podcast sites to receive the podcast, to subscribe to the podcast on a weekly basis. You can find years of podcasts at my site or at those sites. Listen anytime, anywhere. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle, George Packer. You can also follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely.